So to kick us off, what I would like to just ask, you talked a little bit about the correlation between innovation and economic growth. But as you, and state competition. But as you think about these indices driving the reform process, can you talk a little bit about the correlation between state competitiveness and economic reform with kind of political successes? Is there political support? Do states see this as something that brings in positive returns at the ballot box as well?
So Nisha, what you're seeing in India is this huge emergence of the vast Indian middle class. And, people have started voting for roads. They want education, they want health, they want infrastructure. If what recent elections have shown us that those who win elections are those who are able to deliver in terms of infrastructure, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of all this, unlike the previous years. And therefore, suddenly the vast middle class of India has started voting for performance and delivery. And therefore, our view is that if the more you put out all these data in public domain, the middle class will say that I'm only going to vote for those who are going to deliver me. And good governance will become good politics. And that is what all this is leading to. That if you fail in governance, you're failing in politics.
So as we think about that data, and we think about...
And I would suggest that it's been a huge learning experience for us. From districts, ranking districts, so district collectors and district administration is being held accountable for learning outcomes, for education outcomes, for nutrition. For nutrition, I mean, you have 5 different departments. You have to converge everything. They're all being held accountable. So what this data and putting this out is making everyone accountable in the system.
Well, fantastic. That's really one of the things that we think about as technology, as enabling, as you think about e-governance and data.gov, is how to connect that data to the constituency. Oftentimes, these indices, there's a question about the quality of data coming in from the states. Amit, as someone who has worked on a number of these indices, how do you ensure that you're able to get data that is going to be truly reflective of the reality on the ground, and to be able to use that data then to, again, connect those outcomes with reforms at the state level? Talk to us a little bit about that.
So, Nisha, this is a very important question in terms of the efficacy of data. There is a very powerful model within India in terms of how the data comes through the states. And then, of course, we use strong statistical techniques to see if there are aberrations in it, and we really take measures to understand that it is not falsified or whatever. So we use statistical techniques to really get there. And I feel that the data that we are really getting now from the ground is very powerful, very reflective of reality. It is also, and we also see that reflection is coming through within the performance at the state level. So if you really look at what is happening in Maharashtra, we cannot deny that there is performance, because of course the innovation data suggests something. In fact, the 5 states which are at the top, they effectively contribute close to about 60% of the India's GDP. So that means, of course, there is a huge implication that is actually happening. So we see a huge correlation in performance. We see that the data is also reflective of what is happening. And what we are also seeing is that if you really look at this data today, it is really driving a lot of change at the state level. In fact, what happens is, like today, there are states who have come back to us and said that, okay, now can you please tell us how do we improve in a certain metric? Why is it that we have ranked lower on a certain metric than in comparison to the other states? How we can actually improve? So there is a huge effort at the level of states to really take it forward. I think the whole system has now really got geared towards the situation that we need to work together. We need to perform, because that is also a reflection of how FDI can actually come in. Because at the end of the day, it is not that we are investing in India, it's that we are investing in states, we are investing in cities, and that's what actually happens. And if they don't, then you don't really become part of the story, and that's what we are really seeing. And having said that, I think I would like to comment on the previous part as well. When you say that, that whether economic performance has an impact on elections or outcomes, without a doubt. In fact, there are two things which I believe the governments are doing, or especially within the Indian system, that there are those economic objectives and social objectives. If you're not fulfilling those, you're not really coming back. And what we are seeing in India right now is that there is a concerted effort to really create economic outcomes and social outcomes, which is going to be how the elections are going to be won, or how people are really going to get re-elected, because that's where leadership is. And that's a phenomena which is very, very strong. So performance would become such a huge imperative in India as we actually go along, or I would rather say across the globe.
That's great. So, India is such a large and such a complex economy and society. And when you have investors coming in, trying to understand and navigate that, Vishesh, you work with a lot of companies that are investing in India. How do you help them take what can sometimes be a overwhelming process and understand kind of how to disaggregate that into what state level opportunities represent?
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. Let me first of all start by congratulating Google on the video everybody saw. I've had the pleasure of actually going to the Google offices and seeing how Google is trying to teach 50 million women in India through technology to be able to read for the first time, to be able to hear for the first time. What was amazing was not that figure, that sort of opportunity that exists in India. It was how many people at Google were creating that. Can you guess how many that was? 4.
Wow.
4 people at Google were working to create that sort of transformation, and that's what's amazing about Google, as well as India, that opportunity. But coming back to your question, how do you disaggregate India? And I think it's quite similar to the US. You're quite familiar with this in this country. Doing business in India is not about doing business in the country of India. It's about doing business in a state. And I think all the data that we talked about, the great work NITI Aayog's done on the index shows you where states stand on ease of doing business. And therefore, you've got to pick that particular, you've got to work on it state by state. But the opportunity is, of course, the country, and then to take things from the country to the world, as Mr. Kant put it.
And I guess the question to you is, do your clients understand that process of trying to dive deep down into kind of state level and local level information, or how do you help them address that and assess that?
Yeah, and I would say most people, when they first think about doing business in India, do not understand that. It's about let's set up a company in India to do business in India. It's about having that conversation and making it clear. Of course, things have now changed after GST. It is much more one nation than it's ever been before. But I think it's about making that choice based on whether your business is for export, whether your business is for the domestic market, how important is innovation to you, where do you set up, and how do you go about that. I think the key thing there to keep in mind is just because everybody seems to speak English and there's common law, don't believe you understand everything. Just like I mean, things look very similar to your own country, but there aren't.
Rick, you have been assessing kind of India state by state for a number of years and have been kind of watching this whole move towards competitive and cooperative federalism. Talk to us a little bit about the journey that you have been able to see and some of the reforms that you've been tracking both at the central level but also at the state level, and the dynamic between the center and the state in driving reform.
It's been more successful than I would have guessed. It could have been 6 years ago when this government came to office and announced it. I'd seen previous governments going back to the Vajpayee government, which I began working with when I was at the U.S. India Business Council. And it's so very difficult because there were very few tools to get states to do better, and especially in coalition governments. When you rely on a party that has 5 seats in parliament, you're not going to be as easy in naming and shaming them. If they could potentially bring down your government when onion prices spike, you need to be a little bit more careful. Single party majority, as well as having a prime minister who had been a state leader, a lot of great things came together. Having a strong, confident Secretary DIPP that was unafraid of doing this as well. It was a pretty unique mix. But you do see some ebbs and flows on it. The states that I think have done well on the Doing Business Index have not won re-election. So voters still do not look at that. I mean, you look at States like Rajasthan, in my opinion, no state leader in India in the last 10 years did as much to break the mold and try new things as Rajasthan did under Vasundhara Raje, and yet she lost. Chhattisgarh ranked high, Andhra Pradesh ranked high, and these leaders all lost. So you don't yet see voters choosing that the things that we think about as good governance and reform as being the things that they'll vote on. It could be roads, it could be airports, it could be things like that. But if you amend the Industrial Disputes Act, if you do things that are very difficult like that, that has not been the key to success. Probably the bright spot that I see in terms of what voters choose, though, they do now understand the difference between voting for your state party and your national party. If you look at 1999, 2004, and 2009, state elections that were within 2 years of the national election, voters chose the same party almost every single time, 98% or something like that. The last couple of rounds, you actually see voters choosing a different party locally versus nationally. They know Delhi handles certain things, highly regulated industries, things like that, trade policy, defense, and your state does everything else. And you see a differentiation. That's good news in my opinion, because ultimately different parties may be able to do different things. So there's some good and bad. Voters don't reward being high on the ranking list quite yet. They do understand though that the federal government versus states deliver different things, and they're just voting accordingly.
As you think about trying to bring the shared lessons, part of competitive federalism is the other side of it, the cooperative side. So as states are competing, what are the mechanisms, Amitabh, for actually creating state cooperation, sharing of lessons learned and best practices, sharing of kind of models of growth and things like that? How are you seeing that ability to create cooperation as well as competition?
So Nisha, this bit about the point which Rick spoke about, it's also very important. And in a country like India, while you're focusing on needs of doing business and you're focusing on innovation, it's also very important that states focus on some of the key issues of education, of health, of nutrition. And therefore, within NITI Aayog, we also do the ranking of states on education, health, because state governments get re-elected on the basis of the performance on education and health and nutrition. And that's really the key. And one of the main reasons why I think the Prime Minister Modi came back with a thumping majority at the center was because he was able to deliver some of these issues with a huge amount of focus on implementation on ground. And therefore, to be able to provide electricity to every village, to be able to change the lives of almost 500 million women by providing gas connection, by pushing for housing. And therefore, all these need to be tracked also along with that. And governance is all that. It's not just ease of doing business, but it's about the transformation of India. And therefore, all these. So what we do is really that three things. One is that Government of India, we in NITI Aayog have moved away from financial and physical allocations to outcome-based monitoring. We do a very strong outcome-based monitoring. We have very strong dashboards on this. And all the good practices of the states are actually made available to all the other states all across. It's a constant learning process. Secondly, we do a vast range of regional workshops. Region by region by region, we do this. And thirdly, we have the governing body of NITI Aayog actually comprises of all the chief ministers of the state. And once we have the meeting, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, we present all the best practices of all the states there, so that on all these regions, they all learn from each other. And in many of these programs, like we do a program where we handhold states on education and health, all the good practices we pass on. Similarly, we are doing with the aspirational districts. We believe in the spirit of a huge amount of extension and mass communication of the good practices so that they get emulated by all the other districts and all the other states.
And let me add to that, Nisha. I think the work that they do on noting also the incremental improvements is important because, another one of the funny tricks about Indian voter preferences, the states that are generally the most developed, Tamil Nadu, one time a government's been reelected in 30 years. Goa, one time. Kerala, never.
Yeah.
And then states that are lower on the index overall, like Bihar, like Madhya Pradesh had a 3-term incumbent, Odisha, you actually see like some of the states that are behind too, voters are choosing. So it's not just about are you at the top like Kerala, Goa, and Tamil Nadu? But are you improving? And you see voters, moving in that direction. So voter preferences play it out.
So actually it's all, and that's the reason why always we do incremental ranking, not historical ranking.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually Kerala historically may have done well, but incrementally it doesn't perform so well. Other states are catching up with Kerala. It has had such a massive lead over the years, 50 years of lead in education and health, but other states are now catching up big time.
How do you connect, Amit, how do you connect this data that is so rich and yields so many lessons to a larger kind of public understanding of where the country is headed, where the economy is headed, especially in an environment where there is so much data? How do you help your constituencies decipher what's important?
So, Nisha, this is a great question, and it touches upon a very interesting body of work that we have done, what we call as social progress, and we wanted to look at this whole body of work at the district level in the country. What we find is that if you really look at it, like basic conditions of living, and then of course the opportunities and so on and so forth, if we are able to improve, then yes, of course, the populace really looks at it in a very, very positive way. In fact, in the Indian context, 2014 to 2018 has been the most significant period in the history of independent India. Because if you really look at how things have improved, it's just absolutely significant. Something, very simple things like say Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile, they have been so powerful as a driver for social upliftment and for social or solutions for people that it has actually driven absolute acceptance within the people, and that is what is driving it. In fact, quite interestingly, this is where corporations are actually being driven as well, because if they understand that there is that whole issue of purpose that corporates are understanding, because the purpose is going to be driven by the whole idea of how do they solve issues at the local level, and that is what is really happening right now. So there is this whole positive thing. In fact, let me just give you a very interesting number here. If you're able to solve, say, information asymmetry, your GDP multipliers are there. In fact, we just did the study wherein we found that 10% increase in internet penetration and broadband penetration has a multiplier of 3.6% on the GDP. So that means like social indicators and social solutions create multipliers on GDP as well. So it becomes very, very important to look at it. I don't think you can look at it in a disaggregated view. I think it'll be a mistake for any country, for that matter, to say there is this economic development, there is this social development. Both of them are so interlinked and interplaying together that it actually just drives it. In fact, US is a very interesting reflection. You have had GDP growth, but you have failed on social indicators, and that is where we are today. So those are some very interesting things. We can actually have a very different discussion on that. It's on my documentary, which is going to get released very soon, but you can have a look at it.
And certainly, as we think about some of the lessons learned, as you noted, there are applications for the United States and for the rest of the world as well. I will say, back in the day when I was at USAID, one of the things that we came to the conclusion on was that India really was an innovation lab for the solutions that were going to help address challenges globally. And so as we think about think about India as an innovation lab, and also particularly with an Indian diaspora that really is across the globe, how do we create the kind of connections not only within states, but also create the connections to drive lessons learned in a global context? Amitabh, if I could ask you, I know that India has started engaging kind of in a way bringing together, if you think about the African Heads of State Conference, if you think about the significant outreach that is being made, whether it's with the Gulf states or with other parts of the world, how are you taking some of these reform initiatives and the lessons that are being learned from that, and thinking about engaging in an international context as well as a domestic context.
Nisha, we recently had all the heads of the African states on just to do a whole interaction with them on the Swachhata movement, on how the country has been provided 100% toilets across the country. It's been one of the biggest movement, and I think the Swachhata and the providing toilets and focus on cleanliness, and in the last 4 years, we've taken it up from about 24% to 100%, every single school, every single household, and the size and scale of what India does is something which is no other country in the world has been. Same thing with the JAM Trinity, same thing with the biometrics, same thing with a whole range of Government of India programs, is the size and scale of which has a huge impact. And if some of these programs are implemented, and that's why the impact of the Swachhata movement and the impact on providing toilets across and the extension and mass communication regarding that will have such a dramatic impact on the lives of women in India and on the girls' education in India will be so enormous. And that is what we were trying to say by holding this meet of the African heads of states in India. The Prime Minister has been particularly talking about some of these campaigns in all his visits abroad and in all his interactions with them. Recently, our students from Atal Innovation Mission, actually from the tinkering labs, they went to Russia, where President Putin has started a school called SIRIUS, SIRIUS, where he gets the best and the brightest students of Russia. And he was really impressed with what our students had done in the field of water management. And therefore, there's a constant flow of ideas from India across all countries of the world. And we learn a lot from what they've done as well.
So I'm going to have one last question, and then I'll take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. But there's been a lot in the news lately about kind of the economic slowdown that India is experiencing. And in the midst of that, there's yet so much that is happening. There are so many reforms that are being enacted, and there are ways in which the government is trying to streamline, to create efficiency. Vishesh, you have talked quite a bit about the need and the desire to go beyond kind of the large investors and looking at kind of mid-cap companies in the United States and around the world to try to bring in and expand that base of investment coming in. How do you help explain the opportunity in the context of a news narrative that sometimes seems very focused on a number of issues that are right now trending downwards, and yet at the same time as what we're hearing today, there are so many upswing, potential kind of as you look at the months and years ahead. Put that into some context of how you engage companies around that.
Yeah, I think there's many layers of questions within that. But I mean, obviously, the current economic slowdown, I'll let Mr. Kant comment on also. But I think that was, because of that IL&FS crisis, the slowdown in lending and the passing of credit, which has impacted, the economy. And of course, is there a wider cyclical slowdown or not, is still under debate. I think. Does that change the India opportunity, long-term opportunity? Again, Mr. Kant touched on that. Absolutely not. I think, is there another place in the world that's going to see this sort of transformation in the next couple of decades? Absolutely not. And I think within that, if you look at infrastructure, if you look at technology, if you look at education, if you look at the different things that lead to those sectors, there's opportunity everywhere. And I think that opportunity one ought to take beyond the usual suspects, beyond the biggest companies, and we're starting to see that happen. Now, those are the companies that require support from people like you at USIBC. to make doing business across that corridor easier.
And perhaps I can give you the last word on talking about putting the current economic news in the context of the larger, longer-term opportunity that India represents.
So Nisha, as I said, if you look at the last 5 years, India has grown at about 7.5% plus. Our growth has come down from about 8.1% in the last quarter of 2018 to about close to about 5% now. The government of India and the central bank have taken a series of measures. The RBI has brought down the repo rate by about 135 basis points. The government has brought in 5 different boosters. This slowdown largely been on account of, to my analysis, largely been on account of the IL&FS crisis, where banks and mutual funds used to lend to non-banking financial corporations. That's got totally stopped, and because of that, credit supply to a huge range of areas got choked out. But the government has taken, it's been a very responsive government, and the government has taken a series of measures around this and will continue to do so, and we are determined to take India back to a high trajectory growth rate. But it's important to understand that the Indian story has just begun. It's begun because of the vast reformations in the tax reforms. It's begun because of the bankruptcy code. It's become because of the RERA, and it's begun because of the vast digitization of the Indian economy. I mean, these are transformational measures which normally in other countries would take about 6 or 7 decades, which have been brought in just 4 to 5 years. And therefore, they will they are transformational in nature. And the process of urbanization and a young population combined together will really drive India's story in the next 3 to 4 decades of a long trajectory, high rate growth.
Fantastic. I think we have time for one question right now, so I will go to the gentleman in the front. Yeah.
So my name is Ajay Srivastava from eCuber Ventures. Thank you so much. I can see your passion is so contagious. And the current government in India, their passion to do things right is just contagious. We do a lot of things here in U.S. in the federal agencies that trickle down from the perspective of governance and also from the perspective of openness and transparency. That's the thought that's trickled across here in the U.S. federal agencies. We do a lot of technology and innovation here that we do not know how to port across to Indian government and Indian agencies. And some thoughts there on how the companies here who work for the federal government can also take those changes back to India. Some thoughts there would be nice.
So Nisha, we've created a body called the Invest India, and Invest India does this outreach with all agencies. But anyone, I mean, we in NITI, I'm personally open to it. Anyone who thinks that it needs to interact with government agencies, just put across a mail to me and I'll put you in touch with the respective agencies. I'll act as your ambassador as far as this is concerned, on all these areas. But we are totally open to working very closely with all American institutions who are doing outstanding work in their respective areas. It's always a learning experience.
And Nisha, I think the answer to this also is directly on point for this panel. When you get down to the state level and you find out what the state's challenges are on strengthening their electric power grid, water service delivery, things like that, if you've got a technology or service the state needs for the things that help it win re-election and such, you're going to find a welcome partner there too. So get past Delhi, get to Bhubaneswar, get to Patna, get to places like that, and you may find a lot more opportunities too than just showing up in Delhi and saying, I got this thing, where do I go?
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. What I find is that the India story has so much exciting information to it that if we can connect that story, connect these opportunities to audiences here in the United States, to investors here in the United States, in a much more active and consistent way, it will really help us to drive the U.S.-India partnership, drive, for American businesses and American investors who want to be part of India's transformation. So I really welcome and appreciate your visit here today, and hope that we can see more and more of these kinds of opportunities to bring that narrative to audiences across the United States and around the world so that we can help connect to that new India that is unfolding before our eyes. Thank you again very much for being with us. I want to thank all of our colleagues, our panelists.